Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I thought it would be really cool to show you guys just all of the basic things that you need to know before you get started on crocheting. So first we're going to talk about hooks and hook sizes. Here we have a 6.5mm hook, and this just refers to how big the hook is, and the size of the hook determines the size of the stitches that it's going to produce. This just simply means that if you have a bigger hook, then it's going to make bigger stitches, and if you have a smaller hook, then it's going to make smaller stitches. Let me show you here real quick. If we were using a 6.5mm hook to make a chain, then our chain of 5 would look like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got a chain of 5 here, and it's about this big. So here's that. And if we were using something like a 4mm hook, which is 2mm smaller than our 6mm hook, you can see here that it is much smaller than our 6mm here. If we decided to do that to make our chain of 5, there is our chain of 5 here, and you can tell that with the 6.5mm hook, this is bit bigger. This came out a bit bigger with the 6.5, and this is the 4mm. You can also see that the spaces here in the chain are a little bit bigger, and in the 4mm they're a little bit tighter. So that's just the difference between the crochet hook sizes, and most of the time your pattern or your tutorial will tell you what kind of hook to use and what yarn they're going to be using. Now, when choosing a hook for your project, you'll refer to 3 things. Either the recommended hook written on the label of the yarn you're using, which I will show you in a second, or you'll use the recommended hook written in the pattern you're using, or a gauge swatch. Again, I will talk about that just a little bit later. So first, let's go through the basics of a yarn label. This is usually what yarn looks like when you go and buy it in a craft store, and this is called a skein of yarn when it's wrapped like this. You can find other ways that they are usually sold in either a hank, which is yarn wrapped in a twist like this picture here. Usually as a beginner, you're more familiar with this style of yarn, and this is just called a skein. You'll hear it very often. Now, to start with the yarn label, you'll just have the person who produced it, the company that produced it. You'll have the type that it is and the color, and then it'll also tell you the weight and how many yards it is. Now, to keep going, on the back here you'll have the name and color again, and then the lot number. And this part is only really important when you're working on a big project and you need more than one of these, because you want to make sure that you purchase them all in the same time so that you get the same color, because sometimes in the factory they are different shades, which is why they tell you what lot number this came from, so you can match that lot number to the same color next time if you needed to buy more for your project, so that it is all a uniform color. Now, to continue on here, on the back of our yarn skein here, at the top left hand corner, you'll see what is called a gauge swatch. This one right here with the 2 needles is a knitting swatch. So since this is a crochet video, we're not really going to talk about that, and we'll get into the crochet one instead. It is telling us that if we use a 4mm hook, you can see that it's a little dark, I know, but if we use a 4mm hook and we chain 18 single crochets and we make 20 rows of that, 20 rows of those 18 single crochets, then it should come out to be a 4" by 4" square. Now, this is how you determine if your tension is too tight or too loose, and then you just adjust accordingly. You make it a little bit smaller with the single crochets, or you make a little bit less rows, just so that you make a 4" by 4" square. This is just to make sure that when you're running through somebody else's pattern that you are going to come out with the same size that they came out with in their pattern. Otherwise, if you don't really care about that, then you don't need to do this, but that is just what this is for. It just lets you know what it should be. Now to continue on here, at the top of this, it tells you how many ounces or grams is in this ball of yarn and how many yards or meters. This is important when it comes to doing things like blankets or shawls or cardigans or sweaters where you need multiple of these, and the patterns tell you how many yards you need. So if it says it needs 1,000 yards of yarn to complete it, so you'll just need to buy 4 of these to get the yarn that you need. Now onto the bottom here. This part will tell you what it is made out of, the material of the yarn. This one is 50% cotton and 50% viscose from bamboo. There are plenty of different materials that yarns can be made out of, and some of them are acrylic, some of them are wool, some of them are a combination of things. So that just tells you the material. A material is important when it comes to certain types of projects. Like if you're making tops for the summer, you might want to go with cotton because it is moisture wicking and it doesn't get very sticky or hot, whereas an acrylic top will get pretty hot. So you just want to make sure what kind of material you're using and if you need a specific type for your specific project. Now down here, it'll tell you the weight of the yarn. This one is a weight 3 light yarn, and the weight just simply means that this is a thinner yarn. Do we see how thin that is? Whereas something that is perhaps a weight 5 bulky, which is going to be pretty thick, and we'll compare that here. So we see that this is our weight 3 light yarn. You can see how thin that is, and this is a weight 5 bulky yarn. Compared to the weight 3, it is much thicker. The weight tells you just how thick the yarn is, and the weight is used for what kind of project you're working on. The bigger the yarn, the bigger the stitches, the faster it works up, but generally you just want to make sure that you're using the type of yarn that you need for your project because it always changes depending on what you are making. Now for the rest of this, these are just the washing instructions. They use little pictures most of the time, and you can find out what these mean by Googling laundry symbols meanings, or I will also just put a picture right here too. And again, we have our recommended hook under here for what we're going to use for our yarn, for this yarn. So right here is the recommended knitting hook style, and again, we are not going to worry about that because this is a crochet one. So we're going to talk about this part right here. And this one just recommends that you use a 4mm crochet hook for this type of yarn. In the US, that's going to be, if it's a lettered hook, a size G or 6, and if you're in the UK, that's a size 8 labeled hook. But if you have a 4mm hook that says 4mm on it, that's what you need. Just like this, how it says 4mm. It's weird how they decided to do that. There was no universal way to label things, so they just did it that way. But if you found a hook, again, that just says 4mm on it, then that's what you need. And that just means that to get the project to work well, then you want to use a 4mm hook on it. If you use a bigger hook, your stitches are going to be bigger and your gauge swatch is going to be bigger, which means your overall project will be bigger. If you use a smaller hook, it might be harder to work with. It'll be much smaller and the stitches will be much tighter. And that is it for our yarn skein label. The next thing that you need to be a little familiar with is a stitch marker. These are small little safety pin type items that get placed in a stitch to mark a place in your project. Whether it's the beginning of a row, the end of a row, if you change colors, whatever you need it for, these little guys help you keep track of many things when you're working on your project. They just open like this, and then you put it through and close it. Now there are a lot of other tools and gadgets that can be used to make certain parts of crochet easier, but these won't be covered in this video. They aren't a necessity to get started on your very first project. So now we're going to talk about patterns. When you start out, you're going to need a pattern to get going for your first project. A pattern is going to give you step-by-step instructions on how to make a specific item. How to read a pattern in itself is a whole another ordeal, but before we can get into reading patterns, we need to learn how to start working with yarn. You can follow me to the next video here to get started on lesson number 2. I'll see you there, and don't forget to subscribe so you can continue learning how to be a master at crochet.